to the FinTech strategy consultation process. Now, what that graph is showing, with thanks to Franz, is on the bottom line, it's percentage of adult population with a bank account or a financial account. The top line is percent with a mobile account. So the starting point in this shows is quite different to many of the other starting points in the region. Very high levels of inclusion in terms of account ownership, much lower levels of mobile. There's no right model or wrong model there. It's just an interesting starting point. And having the other countries have used mobile to leapfrog in a sense because they've had very low levels of account ownership. So it's a different case. Now, some of the teams, some of the areas that they're raising are, as we've talked about here, getting the whole ecosystem digitized. Payments by firms, to firms, by consumers, between government individuals, between government and firms. If wages, procurement, everything becomes digitized, then that drives widespread uptake, widespread availability of data, and then the innovation and product, the apps, if you like, they go on top of that. And if you think back to that first slide, the Internet of Things stats, the potential for, in the private sector, improving business models, improving profitability, opening up, developing new business models, of having this level of access to digital data facilitated by digital financial services is immense, as are the risks that they mitigated alongside it. So we just wanted to give you a picture of how the content and the focus of this workshop on FinTech is being looked at in that broader digital economy context, with FinTech, digital financial services, as one of the core enabling foundations of a digital economy for all. And just to let you know that there will be a set of analysis and recommendations which will be consulted and developed jointly with the stakeholders here in the coming weeks. So I trust that was a useful overview. I'm going to hand over to KS, or Mr. K. Srinivasan. Srinivasan is a president in the $200 million banking and technology firm. He's based in Dubai. The firm is based in India. His firm, and he's been working with the central bank for 9 years. And I think he has some very valuable insights on the nuts and bolts, if you like, of digital transformation. What actually are the priorities to make it work in the context of the financial sector. So I'll hand over to you. Thank you.
Thank you, Doug. He did attempt to, pronounce my name, so I appreciate that. But let me make things easy for everybody. Feel free to call me as KS, or like the Americans do, K. Now, a couple of points before I get into my show. Just 1 second. Let me set this out. As you can see, I had actually anticipated that the number of people sitting in this room would be probably 10% of what it is now. Being the last session, but I'm really surprised to see that there are so many people still here. So that's possibly the location, captive audience. 1 second, why am I not getting this? Okay. The reason why I'm here is I represent Intellect Design, and as Doug said, we are into the 9th year of our relationship with the central bank. And the Central Bank of Seychelles, way back in 2010, to the best of my recollection, was one among the few central banks in the Africa region that actually wanted to work with a firm that understands technology that's required for central banks. Usually it was always the case of a commercial bank, core banking software trying to run a central bank. So Central Bank of Seychelles' approach was a little different, and that's the reason. So next year we'll be celebrating 10 years of our relationship with them, and we've been having some very interesting meetings in the last 24 hours with the bank. And that's one of the reasons why we qualified in the first place to be here. And until 4 days ago, I said, okay, this is all going to be about FinTech stuff, and I should be able to put all this thing together very quickly. And then when I go through the agenda, then I realized that, hey, this topic is not, my section topic is not necessarily FinTech. FinTech is a subset of the topic. And the broader topic is that, principles of national digital transformation. I think you should have called Prime Minister Modi for this session here. Now I realized that if this is going to be the topic, neither do I represent Government of India, nor do I represent Honorable World Bank or an IFC. I represent a commercial institution, and I must have a very balanced approach. Talking about moonshots, talking about a 2030 moonshot for Africa, my chairman feels that we should have moonshot targets every year. So that's the difference between the moonshot there and the moonshot here. Having said that, we said, then I looked at what's best possible, and we felt that, as a firm, we believe in modernizing technology for central banks, sovereign financial institutions, and commercial banks. And a big part of that story is actually about digitization. It's about digital distribution. So we said that if it is indeed about digital distribution, then it only makes sense if we can extend the word digital to cover other aspects of industries that actually makes a lot of sense from a government perspective. So, and that led us to start working with Government of India on some of their governance programs. And there's one such program that we would talk about. It all has to do with an E, letter E in small in front of, so it's part of eGov. So I drive some of those initiatives as well. So this is an interesting topic. So we're changing gears. So the first slide, few slides, we'll quickly go through this, is about what does national digital transformation means to some of us. And to me, it meant, in the first place, we talked about, many of the earlier speakers did talk about the need for having a national digital identity in the country. There are enough and more research papers circulating around the need for having national digital identity. By far, China is already 100% covered. From an Indian context perspective, almost 83% of its 1.2, 1.3 billion people are covered by digital transformation. The real thing is not about having a digital identity card. It is about the ability to carry out authentication in a most unambiguous manner. It's very helpful. We have seen that in countries where this has been rolled out for servicing, for services delivery in banking, for disbursement of government benefits, and even in terms of scholarships to students. And these are all at the very rudimentary level. And not just that, having a digital identity in the country does have an impact in terms of GDP perspective. For example, it has a positive impact on the GDP of a country anywhere between 3 to 13%. So in Africa, if you roll this out, and to a large extent, I must say that some countries are already adopting these digital identities, the impact will be positive at least to the extent of 3 to 4% to 5%, even 6% in the next 10 years or so. So that's the impact that these can have, because end of the day, it is about delivering. If you have $1 to deliver, if you have $1 to reach to the other end, $1 must reach out there at lower transaction cost. Also, what is possible, what is required is that it needs to be unique, verifiable, authenticated, and most important of all, it must take the consent of the individual. Now, moving forward, the next one is about knowledge. I think there are enough and more sessions that had, previous session was also about, skill upliftment, skill development. As a matter of fact, the gentleman from Estonia, I felt he was education minister, transport minister, science and technology, everything rolled into one. I think as a professor, I think he was like, I was sitting in the front row, and he talked about a lot about skill development, the entire panel, including Matthew Saul and others, and Nicholas. Digital empowerment of economy, citizens, and society. The way I thought I should structure this content is what is important at a national level, and then we go into the financial services level, which is of relevance to us. Digital delivery of services, and last but not the least is accountability and governance, right? Now, very quickly, we heard a lot about transformation happening in many. Now, let's say, for example, the analogy in the case of Seychelles could be fisheries, for example. So from the time you kind of harvest the fish into the time it is packed and sent out or, set for domestic consumption, what happens in that entire chain, right, entire value chain? So what is common in the slide is three things that are common. The ability to connect, the need for automation in those industries, and the third point is, very important, is once you do the connection, once you do the automation, there's so much of data. We talked about data in the last 2 years, so much of data that got generated. What do you do with the data? So the ability to analyze and come out with meaningful results, right? Now you take the example in the first case, agriculture, for example. Why is agriculture out there? Take the case of farmers, or take the case of marginal farmers, for example. If they don't have access to bank, there is no way anyone would know as to how they have actually transacted. So in other words, there is no input mechanism for any credit institution to determine what is the to take credit decisions or to lend, right? That's the first thing. The second thing is also about, for example, we talked about insurance in the morning. There's, I think you referred to insurance in your slide, right? Insurance is a growing area, for example, and what is the precursor for all that? The need to have, the land registries. All lands must be registered digitally, which means that it is possible to determine what kind of a crop insurance is possible. These are good examples in that case. Now, again, talking about electronic reach to customers, what about these supplies? If there is a produce or if there is a harvest, if there is whatever industry that you take, if you have to take it to the final consumer, you have so many of these intermediaries. So the intermediaries make money, but end of the day, the person who's at the marginal end of the spectrum, he gets much less. So there is a need for many of these countries in Africa, and even in some of these developing markets also I've seen, the need to have a marketplace for some of these, and it's evolving. For many, many years ago, they started having a marketplace for steel, they started having a marketplace for commodities. But these needs to come down at the ground level. Now, if I talk about healthcare has always been a challenge. Tell me one country where the doctors are adequate. I heard somebody saying yesterday that in Kenya, they have 100 doctors flown in from Cuba. Now, India is a place where doctors and nurses go to UK and many other countries out there. So there's always a case, even in case of African countries, there's always a case where the number of beds are much lesser, the number of doctors are much lesser. So how do we kind of make sure that there is this effort towards digital transformation? Very, very important. The healthcare of a country determines the healthcare of the nation, health of the nation, right? So you need to have very strong and healthy people there. So few doctors, things like, for example, I took these examples like telemedicine, financial records, claims. All these are small areas, but then very important where these can be automated, or there are opportunities for players in this space out here. And you made a very good point out there that there could be so many technologies floating out there, but unless there is a need, there is a use case. All these technologies would fail. So these are some good examples out there. Retail, again, very close subject. Again, 85%, 75% of the retail. We know there are, Carrefour out there, Lulu's out here, and there could be many other stores, large format stores, medium format stores. But again, the retail industry in many of these developing countries, and I'm sure it is also in Seychelles, a big part of that story is the small and the outlet out there. Yesterday, when I was going to the central bank, I dropped by at a bakery. They said that's the best known bakery in Seychelles. And truly, the product was good. The cake that I had, the banana cake that I had before I went for a meeting with the central bank officials was very good. But then it was such a small store, and they said that it is the best known bakery out there. They were only taking cash out there. So I think that phenomena that is very common in many of these markets. So there is a possibility that there is a play in that space as well, right? Because again, to them also access to credit. The underlying message for all these sectors is that there is a financial play there. The financial play in the case of retailers is the one that I've talked about, flow-based lending, for example. Today, the retailers may not even have books. On what basis will any financial institution even make a lending decision out there? Another subject that is dear to me is logistics. Two things. Logistics. Again, logistics, many people would undermine. I'm sure in many countries, including my home country and many other countries, there are at least 9 or 10 such players that are involved before the goods reaches from where it is produced to where it is being consumed, right? So how about integrating all of these? All these are part of a nation's digital transformation. Why? Because government, there is a legislation passed, or they pass a legislation and say that, I'm going to have a logistics marketplace equivalent to, let's say, an agricultural electronic marketplace. A lot of things would fall in place. It will fall in place with respect to payments. It will fall in place with respect to supply chain. It will fall in place with respect to, the unit cost of logistics for transporting 1 kg of goods can come down by almost like 75% if there is, if they're all able to bring on one common platform. Public procurement, another big phenomena that I feel can drive digital adoption and other digital transformation of countries. Again, this has to happen at a legislative level. Now, take an example, and for any country here, public procurement, government is the single biggest buyer of common goods and services. You take the central government, you take the provincial government, or you take the state governments or the different districts. If you combine all these things together, there is no single buyer, and I'm just talking about common goods and services. I'm not even referring to a procurement of a missile or a submarine or an aircraft or all these other specialized stuff. just common goods and services. There is so much consumption happening out there. There's no transparency, number one. There is no price discovery that's happening. And there is no way that government will actually get costs much lower, right? So these are opportunities from a transformation perspective. Having given a macro picture from my perspective as to what is relevant for nations' transformation when it comes to digitization, from there let's just move towards two areas which I thought I'm going to touch upon, with whom, and we have got some sort of a work that we've been doing quite extensively. One is in the areas of banking. The other is in the areas of banking, and banking, to me, banking includes non-banking financial services institutions as well. And then the e-commerce part of it, right? Now, talking about taking a digital leap when it requires, digital leap requires transformative thinking and political will, So when I talk about political will, there's one particular area where I really want to talk about political will. The first space is, we had Vimal talk in APSA. He was very candid about what's practical, what's not practical, all these speaking sessions out there. The reality is that change is inevitable. We are going to see many of these new age firms coming in, and they are going to take away market share from some of these banks. And there's a next slide that's going to be very interesting. And the positioning there is that instead of sulking, there is an opportunity for many of these financial institutions to actually start behaving like FinTechs. In other words, what we are trying to tell them is that you can run your conventional bank, but there is an opportunity for you to also be a challenger. So that's the space that we advocate for many of these existing financial institutions that's trying to find a foothold in the new era of financial services and financial reach, right? I always believe that fundamentally many of these central banks and sovereign institutions globally have been advocating and regulating and wanting and demanding from their constituents, which is their own banks, their own financial services companies. They do want to automate. There's a lot of stuff that's going on, but many a times they fall back behind. So I think when we talk of modernizing and digital, to a large extent we'll also have to see as to what extent the sovereign nations and sovereign institutions of every country modernize themselves, how they are able to upkeep. Nicholas actually referred to a situation where you said that the fund was available, but then it took time for dispersing. Why? Because there's something like a banking services portal is required for the central banks, etc. There's a whole lot that possibly can do, and that's one of those conversations that we have been having with governor and deputy governors and other executives of the central bank, not just here. I just came out fresh after concluding a transaction with Bank of Mongolia, where we are automating Bank of Mongolia, and Reserve Bank of India is a very old customer of ours. A third important area that got mentioned somewhere today in the morning was while there was a lot of advocacy about financial services, the last mile, access to financial services, low-cost financial services. For the country to go, there is a big part of that is capital market development. In other words, capital market plays an important role in the country's financial health, financial development. And not many countries are there which has a very vibrant, stock market and capital market. In that, if you take a piece of it, how do we advocate citizens to actually subscribe and participate in equity, if not directly through mutual funds? And now, if that's possible, the only way to do that is to encourage the youngsters, the millennials, to start transacting and start buying their, whichever mutual fund instrument that they would want to buy from many of these asset management firms, be able to do it globally. So we actually advocated and we worked with the association, and we set up what is called a kind of a utility kind of a service, where anybody, whether it is an AMC, a banker, whether it is me, or whether it is an aggregator, whether it is a broker, should be able to go and buy an SIP or a mutual fund. Now this is very important because this also has a big role to play in the capital market development of countries. Countries like Kenya has a reasonably well capital market. Nigeria has a reasonably well activity in the capital market. The last one I talked about is public procurement. Public procurement here refers to the one that I explained in terms of government, and we'll talk about it in the next slide. If you look at this slide, very interesting. There was a survey that was done. I think it was a Pricewaterhouse, Accenture, and then we put our own research associates within the firm to actually interpret this data for us. What it really tells us is that if you look at the left, top left, who can disrupt. They feel that 75% of the audience, 75% of the people who were administered the survey felt that it's going to be the startups that are going to be disrupting. Only 28% actually felt that the banks are going to be disrupting. Now, that's a cause of concern for traditional financial institutions. That's why, many of these banks are really worried, right? Now, if you really look at UAE, for example, arguably, it's going to be the first country in the world where there is the true definition of digital in action is you're going to see that the next 3 or 4 years, right? And the general concern is that the size of banks are shrinking, the number of branches are being shut down, almost like, 1,000, 2,000 people are silently kind of asked to go. Now, this is what's going to... So somebody mentioned in the morning that when such things happens, there will be a upheaval in the society, right? So all of a sudden you find that there is a huge resource base that's available. Again, it comes back to the same point that how does one get upskilled and not wait for the disaster to happen. But certain things are not going to change. Payments, funds transfer. 84% feels that there is going to be a lot of activity in payments. You did also allude to it about payments being an important space. This is also talks about it. But more important than not is that payments in the space of, we've seen eBay talk about peer-to-peer almost like 15 years ago, right? They started something out there, then so many companies have come out there. Digital has lowered the entry barrier for many. I think that is and particularly for consumer banking. There was a reference being made today that many of these solutions are targeted towards B2B, and they should be more towards B2C. I think there's a fair point being made, because not just because B2C companies are more valued than B2B companies, although I personally believe that B2B are in for a good amount of valuation in the coming future. But that makes a lot of point, the reference that you made. Now, I also felt that what is important for us to talk about FinTechs and examples of problem statement. Very quickly, we'll breeze through this. I talked about 4 issues, and the last one is a point that kind of summarizes something. Talking about digital experience, what does customers want? They want it to be frictionless in the first place and be able to, become a customer in the first place. There's a change that's happening that we are seeing out here. Many of the institutions would say that you join me, I will give you access to a community. But the trend is reversing. Now we are saying that, hey, I'll give you access to the community, then you become my customer. So we are seeing patterns and anti-patterns coming out in the FinTech space out there. So, capturing of customer data. So the point there is that how can we give them experience? And I'm not even saying that, should a loan application be processed and a decision be made in 60 seconds or so. It alludes to that. In a way, the message is a surrogate underlying point out there, right? Improving customer experience, transaction to conversation. I think what the FinTechs have actually, they have adopted themselves is that what was otherwise, which in my own personal view got missed, is that every transaction has a potential to lead to a financial conversation. I think that's the point that FinTech started focusing on, and we've started seeing some good time of results out there. Without intervention, using robotic components for delivery of services. Then why are we having too many functions? Maker, checker, 4I principle, 6I principle, right? So again, to the point as to what is a business case out there, right? If you need to have 4I principle and 6I principle, we are talking about 3 people doing the same job. But if there is enough data that's available in the bank, it's quite possible that there's only one person who can do the job and the rest can be done by bots, right? Analytics. And the last one is address issues. All these issues must address low penetration. It solves problems dealing with low penetration, inadequate or no credit history, improve collaborative participation, and how transactions are conducted. I think that's the game changer that we are seeing when we're talking of FinTech. Breeze through again these slides. These are some of the examples of where we see personally, end of the day, we are a banking and a financial technology company. We ourselves are seeing that if you've got $100 to spend, I can't spend $100 on every other item, right? I got to focus on it. So we also have realized that it's important for us to even embed some of these FinTechs into our ecosystem as well. So we give them access to market. They give us access to the new type of thinking, new type of doing some stuff. So this morning, somebody ran an average age. Was it you? Talking about a 38 and a 43. I think, that was heartening to see. I thought, all of us are not going to be employed. So, 38 and 43, I'm just not saying that I'm 43, but then I'm not, yeah, okay. What should FinTech bring to the nation, right? We all talked about FinTechs. What is it for me? What is it for the country? First is specific to FinTechs. If they're going to solve a problem, there's no reason as to why a commercial bank or Mauritius commercial bank cannot solve a problem, right? It's because that we're talking about access to banking services. Can any of them do it better, faster, quicker, in a more accurate manner? And that is financial inclusion. And I'm very heartening to meet someone, Association of Financial Institution, AFI. AFI. Honestly, I must confess, I never knew that such a body even existed. So, I must thank the governor of Central Bank for, this is an education session for me as well today. Digital acquisition and onboarding is a cost of acquisition that I'm talking about. Promise to customers. Again, if talking about RegTech, very recently many of these countries have actually set up ombudsman from a FinTech perspective. If I have a complaint against using a service of a FinTech, then there is an ombudsman. All of us have banking ombudsman. I'm sure Central Bank of Seychelles also has a banking ombudsman within the bank. But then, so the institutions are also changing themselves so as to make sure that, they stay relevant, and if there is a dispute, then there is somebody, somebody has to be the authority. The judge and the jury can't be the same. Financial services as a utility, and that was also made as a reference in the sense that, it's a drink by the cup or pay by the cup. Everything is a platform. So is there a model where many of these FinTechs, or for that matter, even institutions, can convert them into some sort of a model where it starts operating like a utility, right? Okay, as a firm, 10-second sales pitch, challenger banking, we are transforming central banks, and we are also transforming public procurement. Very 10 seconds takeaway. Now, what we do, the real fact is that, and I think the Dubai Financial Services Authority, you made a comment saying that out of 140 odd firms there in Dubai, only 2 of them are given licenses, 2 or 3 of them, if I kind of understood you correctly, right? Now, that is, I don't know whether it's good statistics or bad statistics, or is it like you guys are pricey about it, or, you're lenient or not. I don't know about that. But end of the day, our business is financial technology. Our business is not to be, offering financial services. We are not in that business. We are in the business of making sure that how can banks or, national financial infrastructure providers can cope up to the new realities of what's emerging in the world. Yeah. So this we are saying that, we can actually launch a challenger bank in 3 months. We are quite familiar with Moven. Brett King was a speaker in one of our company functions. We are familiar with Fedor, and all those things are the operating model. They all own a bank. They also own a technology, right? We are saying that, we can provide the marketplace. We can help you create the marketplace. So there are different models out there, and there are multiple ways to skin and dice a cat. Very quickly, this is for my friends from the World Bank, Jennifer. This is for Caroline, for you as well, is that, in this exercise, we feel that there is enough play that's there to be done at the national, central bank level in many of these countries. And we believe that there is an opportunity for us to partner with not just with the government, because in some cases, the debt management offices are separate. They don't form part necessarily of the central bank. So we have a role to play in those banks. Yeah? If you've taken pictures, then I can move on. Okay. Now, this is one of the flagship programs. Guys, this is one of the flagship programs, and a program that I was quite intimately associated with right from beginning. 2 years in launch. The background is this. Government of India does almost like $20 billion of common goods and services being procured. How do we get them to buy the same goods and services with a 25% cost saves? How do I make this whole process inclusive? Now, this is one such agenda of Honorable Prime Minister Modi that is actually turning the nation. Only 23rd May we would know how good or bad. That's the election day results for us. But I think, as a company representative, I'm not supposed to take sides. But I have my favorite, and he's my personal favorite, and because of this one reason. And what Government of India did was, and this is something which I would encourage, World Bank regulators, as well as this morning I had the opportunity to talk about this very briefly with the finance minister, saying that if there is legislation that involves and changes in the way government does its procurement of its common goods and services. Common goods and services are car leasing, buying paper, stationery, things like that. If you're able to do that that itself can actually change the way the country could be digitally transformed. Because if you see from this slide to the right side, there's a whole ecosystem operating out there. Anybody who wants to jump into this bandwagon, must have that technology in space. So this is absolutely frictionless. There are benefits for buyers, there are benefits for sellers. I'm not going through all of them, but again, I thought you stole my idea, but then I came in after you, so I can't say that. This is fresh produce. I picked it up only yesterday. So what I realized, if you look at this, there was a mention, and Vimal made a mention saying that at least there should be a couple of unicorns coming in this part of the world. I don't know if Naspers in South Africa, can it be considered as a unicorn? I always thought Naspers is one from South Africa, right? Now, if you look at this chart, you will find that the bulk of them are in the US, in spite of President Trump. Things are happening. Then we've got 3 coming in from China. Sorry, out of 94. 3 out of 10 coming in from China. India and China are very close in terms of population, but very distant when it comes to such things. And if you look at the last 32 odd unicorns are from rest of the world. In other words, out of that 326 unicorns, 32 are from rest of the world. The rest are coming in from 6 countries. Bulk of it is coming in from US and China. Yeah. So then if you pay attention to the low side, you look at the slide with respect to FinTech, 32 unicorns operating in that space. So in other words, there are enough and more opportunities. The objective should not be to be a unicorn. The objective should be to set up something that's of value and that adds value to the society. In the process, you become a unicorn. Because if the objective is to become a unicorn, then you're actually setting a wrong goal for yourself. You'll be disappointed. In closing, let me just say this. There are enough learnings from many nations on how we talked about sandbox. I didn't really particularly talk about the importance of RegTech, because there was enough and more that was mentioned about AI, ML, data, and all that stuff. But sandbox, very, very important. Again, a lot of discussions happening even in India, right? Reserve Bank of India is just setting up a sandbox right now as we speak. So it's a third progressive central bank in the world after the US Federal Reserve and China. So I think the countries are waking up. There are enough and more examples. I would encourage the central bank governors. She went all the way to Hong Kong, but please come to Dubai. Dubai is a great place, and also because of the reason that I am there, it's even more greater. So one aspect that none of us actually talked about was, while all this is just fine, the more important thing is how satisfied is our customer, right? So the focus on user experience is going to be very, very important. It's just not a software issue. It's an issue. It's a cultural issue. So so that is very, very important. I in Intellect stands for innovation. Srinivasan stands for excellence. Intellect can help transform nations' financial infrastructure and public procurement. With this, I end my session. Thank you for your time. Any questions? No questions? We are here for a couple of days. Of course, my colleague Vishal is here and I'm here. So, very delighted to interact. And I once again want to thank the central bank, for giving us this opportunity. We stand tall and we are very humbled by you asking us to be here. Thank you. Have a good evening. Yeah.
Thank you, Mr. KS. We've almost come to the end of the first day of our workshop on building a fintech platform for Seychelles, opportunities and challenges. We have truly been given a lot to ponder on, which will spur further discussions as we tackle the other topics lined up for tomorrow. May I invite Ms. Sofiane Larue from the Central Bank of Seychelles to provide a summary of today's proceedings.
Good evening, everyone. I'm sure it's been a long day. Our minds are probably tired and full of information, so I'll try to keep it as brief as possible. So we started off the day with some of our most prominent leaders giving us a background of Seychelles and some information on the current situation. Now, it it was encouraging to see the confidence with which that they had of FinTech playing an important role in Seychelles, and how this it should also be moved forward, and not forget the humane aspect of FinTech, and how it is at the end goal is to serve those who are most vulnerable, all the while benefiting the economy. We then had an in-depth exploration of FinTech and how Seychelles is performing vis-à-vis many of the components of FinTech. We were privy to some of from some insider information on the FinTech market and really startups, how they work, the dynamics and the demographics. It was interesting to note that most FinTechs are started by entrepreneurs who are in their late 30s, early 40s, therefore having the background, the knowledge, and skills already to drive this market. There are three components of FinTech, the startups that focus on investment, payments, and, sorry, I think I'm tired. Let's do payments and lending. Now, FinTech should focus on identifying problems and how to solve these problems whilst making a meaningful impact. And this requires quite a bit of introspection and not just copying, pasting, and taking whatever solutions other countries are coming for, but finding a solution which works for ourselves. Now, panel one started with a great analogy of FinTech and partnerships working as a relationship. And we see that there are various synergies and conflicts that arise in this field. So synergies mean that relationships need to be symbiotic. So there's a mutual benefit for both partners in the relationship. There's a need to not work in silos and have interoperability while serving common interests. The need for dialogues and consultations, and forward-looking rules and regulations. Now, conflicts usually round about collaboration. It's a term which is usually loosely used with no real depth, because most companies are profit-driven and they look at FinTechs with more caution than a real interest to drive a relationship. We then moved, so in this case, authorities need to identify issues, identify measures of success, and have a vision for what success looks like. Our second panel looked more into financial inclusion and the basic pillars we need for FinTech to be financially inclusive, of course, revolve firstly around identification. Now, locally, we saw that cash is still king. Although the banks are very interested in learning more about the market, of trying to understand the consumers and roll out products which meet their needs, still, cash remains king within our context. From this perspective, it was also identified that FinTech can provide solutions which will both support processes being done by banks and financial institutions, but also create more competition in the market. In viewing some of the threats, it was identified that e-payment cybersecurity, of course, remains a great concern. Our third panel closely looked at investing in people. And we learned that the FinTech market is one which is very competitive, and it's not every FinTech firm who is successful, but those who are successful need leadership qualities, understanding the regulatory environment and the market needs, and how to develop these solutions. Knowledge needs were also identified on the part of the regulators, who need to really understand what is happening in the market, and also from the part of the consumers. Now, the skills and capacity to make use and access facilities responsibly. It was highlighted that the strategies need to be concrete and achievable, with education from a young age, but also from financial institutions' marketing. Now, Seychelles, we identified that there was a lack of skilled labor, which leads us to then require foreigners to come, and this comes at a cost. The alternative, otherwise, is a lot of poaching, which happens within our country. And this is not good. Now, this is where the government should step up and get more engaged in promoting education, However, this is usually slow-moving, slow-paced, and it may not make it to the market when it's most needed. So with that, it was our last presentation, and on the pillars of a digital economy, which was very closely looked at, and captured many aspects of many of the topics discussed today. We then ended the presentation with the importance of digital identity and the importance of digitalization on the supply chain and on the delivery of all services, whilst also identifying some of the disruptions which digitalization, FinTech also creates within the economy. So with that, I thank you very much for your participation.
Thank you, Ms. Lawi. Today has indeed laid the foundation for note. The first day of our workshop comes to a close. We will resume for tomorrow's panel discussions at 9 a.m. We look forward to seeing you back here for this very important exercise. Thank you, and I wish you all a pleasant evening.